Keith Millar, age 73, place of residence Glasgow, Scotland, and original birthplace Dundee, Scotland. My father worked in a garage. My mother worked in a garage for some of the time as well. My mother was much more educated in her position, but in these times, women didn't get the opportunity to go on to higher education really unless they were wealthy. It's a bit sad that my grandfather, who I really looked up to, who was a member of the Labour Party and worked as a chauffeur, he discouraged her from. He said, "No, you need time to go out and get a job. You're 15." So that was how things worked back in the 1930s. So basically, I was brought up in that household. It wasn't a political household, but there were relatives who were more political, like my uncle, who worked in a printing establishment and was in the Labour Party, trade unionist, and who narrowly escaped incarceration in Nazi and occupied Denmark. So, and then I was brought up in the schooling system in Dundee, non-denominational schools, as we call them, people who are had a Protestant background or have no religious leanings. And then by 18, I went to uni in Strathclyde and left Dundee behind. And Strathclyde was an old technical college, became a university. I went into social science because that was really how my education had progressed. And I started to get involved in university politics. Towards my third year, I gravitated towards a libertarian socialist position and created a libertarian socialist group with some friends. And then, that gravitated into being involved in the Glasgow anarchist group of from 1974/5 onwards. So that's the basic structure before I was heavily involved. So I think I was drawn towards, I wasn't attracted by authoritarian parties. I've come across a few people, pushing various Leninist groups and whatever. And I'd previously been in the Young Liberals, which is not as. But although I was in the Young Liberals, I wasn't really. I didn't regard myself as a member of the Liberal Party, which was a centrist party. The Young Liberals were full of radicals who weren't, so many of whom progressed on to kind of libertarian socialism and whatever. So that was my stepping stone, really, from about second year to fourth year, and then fourth year was, and then in the brief period of postgraduate which I didn't complete, was finding all new bunch of people I didn't know before who were not in the university, etc. We opened up a squat. In Britain, squatting tends to be a criminal offence, but this was a university property, and they were a bit more sensitive about it. The main thing they wanted was inside the building we occupied, there was a lot of jars that belonged to the what's it called? It wasn't. It was a department to do with urine, basically. Jars that would store specimens, and they wanted these out. And we did that, and then we riled them a bit because we painted the door red. Well, we were intending to make it red and black, but we didn't get around to the black bit because that annoyed them, because it made it stand out from the other sort of dull green ones, and people passing by would know something was happening. There was a group of half a dozen people of anarchist and libertarian socialist persuasion lived there for it was only a couple of years. And there's another squat down the road too, So this is in the Hillhead area of Glasgow, where Glasgow University is. So that's so from there we started to make, we started having public meetings, we started being involved in community campaigns. It was a very learning process. We were very naive in many ways. Didn't really have much understanding of the general city. But we got involved in campaigns like Fair Fares, which is about bus fares. That was a really energetic campaign. We had a friend who worked, a comrade who worked had a van who we used to drive around at night sticking up posters in far-flung areas of the city, on the outer periphery of the city, what we call housing schemes, that kind of working class housing schemes where people have been thrown out of the inner city and put into these, schemes with very little in the way of amenities. And so we put up a lot of posters there. We also invited people up from London, etc., to speak at public meetings like Albert Meltzer and Miguel Garcia. And a few other, John Oldie was a notable one who was a cartoonist who fled Germany after being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. So it's a interesting characters we came across. So that was that period of mid-70s, really. And then, the squat eventually fell apart, or we had to evacuate it and whatever. And we just moved back into, like everybody else, living separate existences, but kind of coming together weekly or several times a week in terms of political meetings and such like. And then there was a separate project that arose called the Glasgow Bookshop Collective, which there'd been a couple of efforts in that regard, but this was a more significant one. We took over a bookstore, a shop which served as a bookstore, and had it for a couple of years. And then it gravitated into a smaller enterprise too, run by people who are associated with it. But the bookshop collective was about 30 people involved, so it was quite significant. And it wasn't drawn from the same milieu as the anarchist group. There was an overlap, but it wasn't, synonymous in any way. So that was pretty good. So it made a lot of people, people moving up to Glasgow from other places, England, etc. We came across more of them in the bookshop collective. Another thing is that the guy I mentioned in regard to the getting us lifts around the city and putting up posters, his parents were anarchists. Chaz, just short for Charlie, and Molly Baird, who had been active in the 40s, but Molly Baird was a descendant of somebody from the 1920s, the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation, which was a libertarian socialist breakaway from the, not breakaway, but expression of discord with the Russian Revolution, the course of Russian Revolution, etc. So they were fantastic people to meet. Charlie had been a barber, he ran a barber shop because he didn't have a union card, didn't have a national insurance card at one stage. But these people really impressed me, even though they weren't particularly active then, but they kind of did come out of the shell a bit. And there were some other people too. We met Robert Lynn, who was an incredible character. He was a shop steward, but he was a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde. He actually used to be a hawker, which was like selling all sorts of shoddy goods and street corners and things as well. There's some other nefarious activities he engaged in, but he was an incredible character. And there was some others too. Some of the older anarchists we met weren't all as saintly as Charles and Molly Baird. Farquhar MacLeod, for example, who's his writings you may come across. He is an impressive character in many ways, but he had some dubious practices. People who were not respectful of women the way we were. We were evolving when women's liberation. We were starting. So we were still naive, but we weren't like them. We didn't believe that somebody, because we're anarchists, can go out and do whatever we wanted, irrespective of people's actual desires and wishes. So, I'm not saying they weren't all like that, but Park in particular was a character that you had to be on guard for, because often the demon drink would be part of it. So, but these all characters were met, and then of course I was involved in the claimants union, which was its claimants union is people who are unemployed. So we were unemployed, and for a while in the late 70s, and we got involved in the claimants union, and there was about 12 different claimants unions around the Glasgow area, and then we also federated into a national federation of claimants unions, and you had one trip down south to a national conference. But it was an interesting process that a lot of the claimants union weren't terribly political. We met people though in Castlemilk, which is an outer scheme of Glasgow, who were very political. John Cooper in particular, an incredible character who's still around today. Definitely worth interviewing John Cooper, although he doesn't do Zoom, so probably a no-no. He maybe do written questions. But anyway, so that takes you up to about 1980. Do you want me to just carry on? Yeah, the 80s, there were a new bunch of people who dropped out of Trotskyist movements, moved towards anarchism, and they formed a group called Practical Anarchy. And Practical Anarchy was the publication, and Clydeside Anarchists was the group. And that was really active and went out of their way to kind of get up the noses of traditional left and draw attention to a different type of politics. So that was active from 80 to maybe 85. And then there was a different generation of anarchists came around from about mid to late 80s. But before that, we'd also, the mining strike had started in 84. So there was a lot of activity there to support the miners. Again, an educating process, because the miners obviously were in strike, but they weren't revolutionaries in the sense that they had this background that we had. Many of them had contradictory views, and Glasgow had sectarian views. So many of them came from Protestant backgrounds that supported Rangers Football Club, which is quite a reactionary football club. So they were kind of odd in that respect to us, but that was just a part of the contradiction they lived with. They didn't see it that way, They were in revolt for justifiable reasons, and the mines were getting closed down. The Counter-Reformation was formed at that time. That was a collective of people from around Scotland who produced a broadsheet to publicise initially what was going on in the miners' dispute, and then we carried on after that to publicise struggles and resistance from around the world. And then, of course, the poll tax came about through Thatcher's government trying to impose it. And we formed local groups, which again, a huge educating process, because we were involved in the local neighbourhood in a way I'd never been before. I live in an area of Glasgow where that football club I mentioned was actually based. I was there because it was handy for my travel to my work in an advice centre. But there was various lefties who lived in the area, probably because it was cheap accommodation. And they got together and formed a group. And it was people who weren't, lefties, just local people who were pissed off with the poll tax, which is already a levy on the poor. It was, irrespective of income, basically, And so we got together with them and we formed a local group. And similar groups sprung up around Glasgow, but some were libertarian socialist inclined, like me, broad pluralist, and others were run by political groups like Militant. And some of the Militant were more effective than some of the other ones. Some of the other ones in areas which should have been promising fell apart because of political squabbling, effectively sabotaged their own project, So we formed there was a little paper called Refuse and Resist, which came about through independent anti-poll tax groups trying to publicise what we were doing. So
Because the poll tax eventually was replaced, so there was a victory there. There was obviously a lot of, we went a lot of demonstrations, but didn't have the riots and things that they had down in London or anything. It was a different situation. But, it was a very important era in terms of political involvement. And then the next thing that came about was totally different, but again, drawing in a completely different bunch of people. The Free University of Glasgow, which wasn't an actual tangible institution, but a kind of educational group which met in different locations and, just had talks and discussions on various topics. Some about the self-determination of people in Scotland, other things more direct libertarian socialist. The first Free University meeting, which is on tape, it's been digitally recaptured, was 1987. And the people I mentioned, Charles and Molly Baird, were present. And they at the time had been getting a visit from people who emigrated to Australia. Jimmy Rayside and his wife Babs, and then we brought in John Taylor Caldwell, who was by far the most sus politically of the five, because he lived his whole life for the political struggle, and his books are being published now. You can get them through Luath Press, which is Luath. He was a wee guy who was essentially a disciple of Guy Aldred, so it made it different because I knew he was a disciple of anybody at the same country, but that was just like era he lived in. He'd been mesmerised by the oratory and the charisma of Guy Aldred, as Ethel MacDonald had as well. And so that was, way back to the 20s and 30s, but unlike Aldred, who died in 63, MacDonald, who died in 59, Patrick, who died a bit later, John Taylor Caldwell was still alive. He lived till his 90s. And he wrote these books. I interviewed him a few times, and he was a very demure man but he had lived in a flat with Ethel MacDonald before and after she went to Spain. So, again, a very impressive character. I mean, the two groups, when they came together, the anarchists and the kind of Aldredite Caldwell, had political differences, and that kind of resurfaced there and then. Clearly Caldwell was thinking about the whole era all the time, as the others were immersed in their daily lives, which were completely different. So it was a very interesting meeting, but we did manage to. And we had a couple of other meetings over the years with Caldwell, who came along and tried to educate the younger anarchists about the past and what they did then. The free speech fights in Glasgow Green and the other things that happened in the 30s in particular, 40s. So again, fantastic influences to meet these people and to and I say some people obviously have a legacy like Caldwell, but obviously there was no Zoom at the time. There was no social media the way it is now. Although I think Caldwell, it might be wrong, maybe it is interviewed somewhere on tape, but certainly it is these audio transcriptions and the books, including Come Dungeons Dark about his Aldred era, and another one about his childhood, which is quite brutal, brought up in Belfast and then moved to Gorbals with his parents. And he worked in a cinema as a page boy because he was small, he looked like a wee cherub. So that was him. From there, although I carried my involvement on in two projects, one called Here and Now magazine, which I've not touched on yet, which is a theoretical magazine that arose in 85 and carried on till 97. It was latterly in conjunction with a group from West Yorkshire, some of whom had been involved in a group called the Pleasure Tendency. which I suppose was a neo-situationist grouping. And they worked with us and produced a magazine. But basically, we produced one edition, they produced another edition, which their editions tended to be twice as big. We should have been, really streamlined a bit more, so there was more harmony between the two. But that's what happened. And I carried on. I was the only one here now that was also involved in counter-information, which was, as I say, people from Edinburgh, Grangemouth, and Glasgow came together and produced this news sheet. And of course, before the interview, if you Zoom now, we'd just be doing it via Zoom. But now we were actually travelling midweek after doing our jobs to a location, maybe in Grangemouth, which is halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and then travelling back. So there was a lot of dedication involved. But we did get on really well with these people. So, every one of these people today that I'm still in contact with, we have enormous respect for each other. But one of them, Edinburgh, Mike, is probably a more influential figure than me in terms of, needing interviews and stuff. He's unlike me. He's not held down a regular job. He's been a full-time agitator virtually from his 20s right through to now his early 70s. Fantastic. So although I was involved in these projects, my involvement did, because I was getting on a bit. I was a 40-odd, when your involvement tails off a bit. So there was a new generation too, and you want to give them their head. Like Ian Mackay, who's probably Glasgow's leading theorist who's still alive, did the anarchist FAQ, etc. So he comes from Glasgow, from a working class housing scheme originally. And I actually was a school librarian for a year, but unfortunately I passed never across because he was too young. He must have still been in primary school at the time. Anyway, so that's what happened really from the mid-90s, although pre-university carried on until maybe 94, and then other projects was carried on having political meetings and things, but I was going along as a attender rather than an organiser for most of these things. It was really only the counter-information group, and then because 97 Here and Now stopped, and then counter-information kind of fizzled out with the internet coming along in 2004. So that was it, really. So I would say my key involvement is probably in mid to late 70s through to the mid-90s. Although, having retired, and this has been generally true of other people involved in this project, I'm now involved in called the Glasgow Keeley. We are probably more involved than we have been since age 20 odd because we have time in our hands. So the Glasgow Keeley is five retired folk, 2 women, 3 men, who not all from liberty and socialist backgrounds. Certainly there's one who isn't, but that's a kind of muckraking local news sheet which puts anarchist ideas across in a kind of way that is not kind of ideological. So that's the thing I'm involved in today. And then the Spirit of Revolt archive, which is probably known around the world because it's been digitised and all sorts of images. A number of collections are up there, including mine, but other people too from that era. And so it's worth discovering. But that's really what's happening now. We have an offshoot of the Glasgow Keeley called the Keeley Folk Club because I was concerned that folk club having collapsed. There was no space for radical folk singers any longer. So we had David Rovics over. Well, he does a tour anyway, and we happened to fit him in. And then we've got Rob Johnson, who's an English radical folk singer who's coming up in October. And we've also got a joint working arrangement with a woman who goes under the name of Dr. Normal, which is a kind of stage name, and she's quite radical, spiky, a breath of fresh air. And some of her concerts go on at a place called Galgale, which is a trust which evolved from teaching people how to do minor shipbuilding to a kind of forum for radical ideas, and it's in the Govan area of Glasgow. And so progressive. Yeah. So and there's people around Glasgow. The thing about Glasgow has never been just a bunch of 20-somethings together. It's always been people of different generations. And that's been a learning thing. So the present is some of the projects, like, for example, last year's Radical Book Fair was largely organised by people who were 40 to 70 age group, really, But then there's other younger people like who have created the Glasgow Autonomous Space and the IWW, which I'm involved in as well, I should have mentioned, is they have an office now as well. So I probably meet more younger people than most because of involvement through the IWW. To some extent through the archive as well, but I don't don't go in and archive and digitize as much as I used to, but we have a full-time, I have an archivist who's not full-time, just one day a week, but she's fantastic, Paula. So she helps keep it going. And the archive was really the brainchild of a guy called John Cousin spelled with a Z, the old Huguenot name. He came up with the idea, and some of us got on board with it because we were aware that people's archives, people's legacy was just disappearing. Yeah, it was great. Somebody like Caldwell wrote these books and things, but there was no, a lot of the documents and records and things that long lain undiscovered. You forget about yourself. We're lost forever. So we lost a lot of people that way, but fortunately, from 2011, we created the Spirit of Revolt Archive. Sorry, I'm quite nasal. So that is based in the Mitchell Library. We've got a good working arrangement with the archivists there. We've got to be. The only problem with the room we have is it's a working room, but it doesn't have Wi-Fi. They through their source, so we have to. So the whole thing's voluntary. We've got wages to pay in respect to the archivist, and we've also got running costs. So we have to raise money for that, but we do manage it at the moment quite well. They say John Cousin was an incredible character. He's still got websites up to Radical Glasgow website, and also a great one called Strugglepedia, which is like Wikipedia, but with geared towards Glasgow struggles and Glasgow personalities and such like. But we like to remind people of history. So Glasgow Ceilidh, for example, in 18 days on the 31st, has the annual commemoration for 1820, which is when the Scottish rebellion against a very repressive London-based government who obviously determined to make sure unions didn't evolve and get people any rights. Because clearly there was no democracy. There was just a constitutional democracy for the noblemen and rich entrepreneurs. So 1820, there was a rebellion. It was infiltrated by agents of the state, and it never quite happened the way it should have done. Obviously, coordination was such a problem around Scotland. You relied on letter or people. So it led to 3 people being executed and a few other people too being killed as part of an effort to rescue people who had been arrested. Other people were transported, but 3 people arrested, Hardy, Baird, and we in particular focus on a guy called James Wilson, who was 60. He was quite old for his age, and he was executed, head chopped off in Glasgow Green in 1820. And because that site's still there, the green's still there, and we have an annual celebration, and there'll be some music. Which this year, incredibly, there's an album specifically about 1820 that's been written by a group called the Lanarkshire Songwriters. Lanarkshire is just to the south of Glasgow. It's an old historic county, and they penned stories. They did one previously on the Spanish Civil War, and this is about an international brigade, and this is about 1820. So this is an annual thing we did. Last year we had a radical group called the Tenementals, who are a kind of pop group who sing songs about Scottish history. And they actually got a lot of coverage recently. They're all academics at Glasgow University, so they don't have to make a living out of it. They just do it through fun. So I had them last year. And the year previous to that, we had people dressed up in wigs, acting as a judge and doing street theatre. So then later that same afternoon, the 31st, is from a different group involved around Carlton Books, which is a kind of Republican, Scottish Republican, Irish Republican bookshop. They have a commemoration for the Carlton weavers who were killed in 1790s, perhaps, again during the Napoleonic era when everything was cracked down on. So the cemetery there in Carlton, Glasgow, which is just east of the city centre, that happens, and there's a similar occasion. There's slightly more people from the side left come along to that one than our one, but so we try and keep these traditions alive. Not all the young people today in the IWW or the Glasgow anarchist scene necessarily appreciate what we're doing. That's often the case, that people have different generational concerns, and if you've been working all week, maybe a Sunday's a day of rest or recovering from partying all night, as opposed to trotting along to an annual commemoration. But we like to do things like that. We're involved in the small shop thing, which is about the Paisley weavers who, a wee bit later in the 19th century, who defied the bosses there. And to the credit of the local council, they actually have a festival in support of what the weavers did, called Small Shot, SMASHOT. So a lot of talking, sorry. So yeah, we went along to that, and we take part in the annual parade, and the IWW get out and show their flags and sing radical songs. They're mostly involved in organising workplaces, but this is the secondary activity that they do. So that's what's happening today. It was probably the odd year when little happened or things were a bit quieter, but generally there's been a consistent movement of radicalism in Glasgow right through from the 1880s to late 1880s right through to the present day. So that's not true of every city. Obviously in London that would be the case, but in a lot of even bigger cities, they don't have this continuity that we have. And we've always also welcomed people from abroad who settled here, maybe because they were running from army service or just moved over here for a while. We've had people from the USA who've moved here for a while just to get a different way of living. One being Eric Chester and Susan Dorazio, who lived here for a few years until a year ago when they moved back to get medical treatment in the States, and now live in North Carolina. So it's been a great experience. At the same time, a lot of people involved in things naturally drop out for a while because of children or they have care duties. When I was a carer for a while too,
and that can really consume your time. But you have to, some of these things tends to come along, especially when you're in your 50s. Okay. And 60s, maybe. Well, I'm not one of these over-optimistic people, largely because I've how we've destroyed the planet. And it's a different era. We were brought up and certainly aware of songs like, Joni Mitchell and Neil Young writing about devastation, but that still seemed a million miles away. We weren't aware of what was happening. So we've always got to be, I suppose, a tribune of putting out the correct information about the world, and getting amongst the people and trying to sort of, because people are just, there's a system just induces amnesia, social amnesia, and so we've got to always try and awaken some sort of spirit, some sort of memory of class. People are just so atomized and whatever that it's difficult. People just seek an easy life and despair, especially when they see things like Palestine going on. And it's, it can just have that. It makes people angry, but also makes a lot of people just demoralized, and, turn into themselves. So we have our role in terms of that. And it's important we have projects like the IWW, which, is engaged with working people, particularly young working people in industries that are often not particularly organised, so it can have some impact. So these are all we can really do. I mean, it's a huge Herculean task, and we've got to kind of engage with people in the green movement and stuff, and issues like climate change and such like. And it's just a constant process of education, and too much of it goes on social media these days, but clearly we've got to engage with that too. But yeah, we just carry on. I mean, struggle is part of everyday life, and that's what happens. And the comradeship you have from these other people, these friends, and they just that just gives you strength and helps you carry on, and recharges your batteries. And a lot of these people, I say, from all around the world too. It's fantastic to, the IWW branch of people from, parts of Europe, Colombia, and in Latin America, and such like. So it's great to meet all these people and, and share that culture together. So that's all I can say. I mean, I'm not, I can't really paint a rosy picture. That's just how life is. I mean, here we've got a kind of neoliberal government posing as Labour, and this left alternatives have started to arise and dish to the Greens, but the sophistication in the media and sort of denigrating people is just incredible. You just had to see that what happened to Jeremy Corbyn when he was a Labour leader, how all sorts of muck they raked up. So we'll see what happens. But I certainly don't want to go down the road of being very narrow and sectarian and purist. It's so easy to do that, but it's not about carving out a little niche for yourself, which I felt with a lot of the groups, especially situationist inclined groups in the past, where it's not. That's just a game. This is more important. So basically, it's about trying to be inclusive, trying to be responsive to people, but also, setting things right. If all sorts of rubbish comes out of their mouths, and maybe explain, well, how do you have these views? You're reading all this shit all day. It's conspiracy theories, mass media from people with vested interests who are, just there to make a profit and keep people divided. So anyway, this is all part of the parcel of everyday life for every radical thinking person around the world, I think. And obviously, to some extent, I've lived in an era where
unlike Northern Ireland, for example, I've not been through heavy repression. There's no doubt surveillance goes on, but it's not. No one lived in a really repressive regime as such. With fascist groups come and go, and there's a challenge we met now as well, but it has a use for the political class and the economic powers that be from time to time. But we'll just have to rise to that challenge and see how things go.